Hey guys, I'm Madison Campbell. This is for my religion class, and I'm just here to talk to you about Jesus and his enemies. It is a narrative, it's a narrative conflict about the four Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the New Testament. Okay. It's 240 pages long. It is by Robert R. Beck. He is a Catholic priest and professor of religious studies at Loras College. He is a leading practitioner of socioliteracy analysis as well. Just to kind of get our feet wet and like what we're going to talk about in this vlog, during this narrative, he kind of like gives us an overview of what the Gospels are actually going to teach us when we read the Bible. So he kind of gives a narrative perspective as well with that. He gets our feet wet, like, so you're walking through a garden and it's kind of like picking the fruit and just eating a bite. So like that's what we're going to talk about during this, is what he's able to teach us in this narrative. It's a fresh contribution to biblical teachings of ethics and violence as well. Okay, so let me just begin. The gospel narrative is also a witness of divine moving into history. So, today we kind of relate back to things that have happened back millions of years ago that, as we know, is just as readings. That's all we can see it as. So, religion is just in the sense and to separate politics, but supports and judges it as well. So let's begin by moving into Mark. So, Mark's story covers a time period of less than a year. Let me just quote back to what I was reading in the actual book for you guys. So, page 32, it's Mark, and it says, Mark's story covers a time period of less than a year. It moves into early work in villages of Galilee towards Jerusalem, where it ends. So it ends in Jerusalem. Instead of regular visits into the city suggested by Luke and John, as we would realistically expect Jews, we have a single movement toward the city that gives shape to the whole story. So Mark is in control of his material, so only just Mark, and his abbreviated narrative is initial presenting a problem to be solved. Its narrow focus needs to be accounted for, and this raises the question of genre. So that's kind of what we're looking at whenever we're reading Mark. So let's move into Matthew. So whenever we come to the New Testament, we're going to go Mark, then Matthew. And Matthew's story, it was 15 to 20 years, we don't know exactly, but somewhere in the time span of 15 to 20 years after Mark's gospel was circulated. So it was out into the public relatively time after Mark's. So it begins with genealogy. Some people may or may not know what genealogy is. It's important functions for times of transfer or property. So whenever we're talking about Matthew, just keep genealogies in mind because it has a big role in this story, okay? So let's kind of see. Matthew insists of a royal status in this New Testament, okay? There's two scenes similar to Naomi's arrival. So it says his bloodshed awareness can be seen in the story of Herod's massacre of the Bethlehem boys. So as we go into Matthew, we can kind of keep this in mind. Genealogies, we're going to follow that storyline all the way across, okay? So let's move into Luke. Luke takes a different view on this, responsible for gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. So there's 260 teachings in the New Testament, and 52 are in Luke's Acts. So if that tells you how important Luke is, it's a very central role in the New Testament. So let's read this important quote that when I was reading, I marked this because it just really stood out to me whenever I was reading it. So it says, an important effect on Luke's approach is not to be ignored. It has expanded horizon of his narrative. In the early chapters of his story, he includes announcements that place events within a world of horizon. When Luke announces his birth of John the Baptist, he situates the events in the days of King Herod of Judah. Okay, however, when he tells the story of Jesus' birth, he writes in a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus, while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And that is Luke 2, 1 through 2. So it's important task for our reading is to identify the implied reader. So as we're reading, who is he talking to? Who does he want his teachings to talk to? In Luke, it's important to set the action in order which is presented. So it is presented, this is how we're going to take it, and this is how we're going to act upon his teachings to us. The last thing that this narrative talks about is John, the last chapter. So John is he takes a different approach than everyone else that's written anything. It's a different place, different language, different order. It's poetic language, so it's not just like biblical teachings. It's a poetic language presented to us in the New Testament, ultimately. So his teaching is over a 3-year time span. So he begins with 2 perspectives, above and below. Okay, so for us, it would just be easier to say 2 narratives. Normally start with a significant event. So like as we know, like whenever we start reading a book, it's normally significant, something that happens that starts us off, climax and things like that. So this is what happens. Luke 1:14 says, and the Word became flesh and lived among us. So the Word became flesh. We stand for these teachings, we live by them, and we follow them. So what he tells us to do, we abide by, ultimately. So the narrative project is to see its unfolding. So the narrative projects what's going to happen. We can kind of estimate what's going to happen, but we don't know for sure. So I would definitely recommend this book more for ages like high school and up. Give you a more broad perspective of what's going to happen. Like I said in the beginning, we kind of get our feet wet whenever we're reading this of what is to be said or talked about whenever we're actually reading the New Testament. Questions to ask yourself from the book: what events are happening at the time that the gospel seemed important? So what's going on? What's making these readings stand out? These stories are happening. So like I said, I would definitely recommend this book if you haven't read it. I would definitely try to do so, especially if you're very religious or into Christianity. But that's about it. So I hope you guys have a good day.